This is an industry that's directly benefiting from human suffering. And as you'll learn today, many people, through our banking and personal and retirement investments, are unwitting supporters of the abuse. We all have a role to play in dismantling systems that prioritize profit over life and in building new humane models. I'm Malaika Mapalala. I'm an investment advisor and partner at Natural Investments, which is a nationwide investment advisory firm that has specialized in socially responsible investment for over 30 years. Alongside our portfolio management and financial advising work, as a firm, we've been deeply engaged with supporting shareholder advocacy, and we're one of just 7 advisory firms in the country that is engaged at the highest levels of policy work to protect people and planet and our financial systems. The issue of human rights abuses in the private prison system has been deeply important to us and many of our clients. So socially responsible investors around the country are advocating for policy reform at for-profit prisons, as well as divestment to stop the funding cycle. I'm very pleased to share this opportunity to hear from these amazing experts. Not only will you learn more about the issues here, you'll also learn how you can organize and lead divestment efforts in your own community and life. Our first panelist is Kirby Crow. Kirby is my colleague and a fellow investment advisor at Natural Investments South Carolina office, where she helps individuals and families invest according to social and environmental values. In fact, throughout Kirby's life and her career path, it has been one that's led by her passion for putting social and environmental causes in action. Besides her work as an advisor, Kirby also currently coordinates the financial literacy program for Soteria Community Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit that empowers men returning from prison to succeed personally and financially and professionally. She's going to offer us an overview and history of the issues here. Kirby, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Malaika, and thank you to everyone who's watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today. So as Malaika mentioned, I'm going to start by giving just a brief overview of the private prison industry and the main players in that industry. And then I'm also going to talk about the opposition efforts to the private prison industry, and also specifically within that efforts of divestment. So the idea of making money off of prisoners in our country has been around for about 2 centuries in the US. At the beginning of the 19th century, our country had a lot of quickly growing agricultural and construction needs. And so the idea of leasing convicts out to do that work became a very popular idea. Before the Civil War, and actually shockingly late into the 20th century, state penitentiaries, and especially those in the South, were essentially run as plantations. So convicts were planting and harvesting cotton and agricultural crops for basically no pay. When the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, that abolished slavery, which was obviously, a wonderful step in our country. But written into that amendment was what many people consider a loophole, which is that slavery was abolished except as punishment for a crime. And so ever since that time, that language in the 13th Amendment has been exploited in order to generate profit off of our prison populations in this country. The private prison industry really started coming into its own in the 1980s. And that was when President Reagan accelerated and expanded the War on Drugs initiative. This is an initiative that had begun under President Nixon. It criminalized and penalized drug use in a much harsher way than ever before. And the intention was essentially to disrupt left-leaning communities and Black communities. And so one of the ways that President Reagan expanded these efforts was to adopt zero tolerance policies around a lot of drug-related crimes. And this had the effect of skyrocketing our incarceration rates here in the United States. So right around this time in the early 1980s, in 1983, a company was founded called the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, which is now known as CoreCivic. And the very next year, in 1984, CCA was awarded a contract to manage a prison facility in Shelby, Tennessee. This was really a big transition for the private prison industry, because up until that point, private corporations had really only been contracted out to manage isolated services in prison facilities, such as dining or healthcare. But with the facility in Shelby, CCA was now managing the entire facility and obviously able to maximize their profit off of that facility. And then also in 1984, the company that eventually became Geo Group, which is another major private prison company, was founded. So CoreCivic and Geo Group were founded almost concurrently. I just want to mention that CoreCivic and Geo Group were involved with the management of prison facilities almost since their inception, but also the management of immigration detention centers, which has relevance, obviously, to what's going on in our country right now. So bringing us up more into the present, as of the mid-2010s, about 20% of our federal prison population and 7% of our state prison populations were housed in for-profit facilities. So as you can see on the screen here, I've already mentioned CoreCivic and Geo Group, which are by far the two biggest private prison companies in America. Two other really significant ones are the Management and Training Corporation, or MTC, and a company called G4S, which specializes in security services. And then 6 banks have been identified as providing the major financing and lending that supports this industry. As you can see, these are Bank of America, SunTrust, BNP Paribas, US Bank Corp, JP Morgan, and Wells Fargo. The reason that JP Morgan and Wells Fargo are highlighted in red is that in March of this year, both of those companies announced their intention to halt financing for the private prison industry, which is wonderful. But it's June, several months later, and no action has been taken by either of these companies on this initiative. And also, I just want to point out that even if they do eventually halt their financing, both JP Morgan and Wells Fargo are still shareholders of both CoreCivic and Geo Group. So I doubt that they will ever fully divest from these companies. So now that we've looked at the private prison industry, I want to talk about the opposition efforts to it. As soon as these companies were ramping up in the 80s and 90s, opposition efforts were also getting started. One of the most influential is a group called Critical Resistance. They were started in 1997 by the prominent author and activist Angela Y. Davis, among others. And throughout their basically 20-year history, they've launched national and state campaigns to fight what they call the prison industrial complex, which is a phrase that they actually coined. So they've really influenced the national conversation on this issue. A few years later, an organization called Enlace was started. They are an international economic and racial justice organization. They're now known as Freedom to Thrive. And about 10 years ago, they made prison divestment a focal point of their organizing. And then more recently, 2 organizations have really brought attention to this issue in a new way. Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013, and then the Movement for Black Lives in 2016. And these organizations have brought renewed attention to mass incarceration, to racial profiling, and police brutality, obviously through the lens of these actions as they bear on Black communities. And the Movement for Black Lives actually discusses prison divestment as part of its platform. So they've been quite influential. So specifically within opposition efforts to the private prison industry is kind of a subsection of divestment efforts. And so divestment, I just want to quickly define. Divestment is simply the selling of investments. Obviously, individuals and institutions can sell investments for any reason. In this context, we're talking about the selling of investments because they no longer align with the investor's personal beliefs, values, morals. Often in this situation, divestment is undertaken as part of a movement, whether with other individuals, other institutions, with the intent of having a negative financial impact on either a particular company or an entire sector or industry. Essentially, divestment is investors saying, we can no longer justify making a profit off of your core business model. With the private industry, they're saying we can no longer justify profiting off of the incarceration and detention of human beings. So there have been some really big milestones with divestment in the last few years. In 2015, Columbia University became the first US university to divest its endowment from the private prison industry, and that was primarily due to a student-led campaign. The year after that, in 2016, the Justice Department under the Obama administration announced that they were going to phase out contracts with private prisons. Unfortunately, this order was rescinded in February 2017 under the Trump administration. But even with that reversal at the federal level, you've seen states and cities move forward with their own divestment efforts. In 2017, in May of 2017, all 5 of New York City's pension funds announced that they would be divesting. The state of New York followed suit in July of 2017 with its own pension fund. And then there was a really big victory in November of 2018 when CalSTRS, which is the California State Teachers Retirement System, the board of CalSTRS announced or voted to divest in November of 2018. Educators for Migrant Justice, which is a grassroots organization, had a huge impact in that effort. Also, similarly in 2018, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund announced that they would be divesting. And then bringing us up to just within the last month or so, again, New York State made an announcement that in addition to their own pension divestment, they were going to prohibit state chartered banks from financing and lending to the private prison industry. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the world of divestment. I believe later I can answer some questions about actions that individuals or institutions can take in their divestment efforts. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to Malika and to our other speaker.
All right. Thank you so much, Kirby. I just want to point out, you made mention of Migrants, Educators for Migrant Justice, which is actually the initiative led by Emily Claire Goldman,
Yes.
who would have joined us today. So I really encourage you, so Emily started an organization called ESG Transparency, and Educators for Migrant Justice is their initiative. And they successfully got CalSTRS to divest from the private prison industry, and they're currently working on CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. And so I encourage you, especially if you're from California, and especially if you're a member of one of these pension funds, please do check out Emily's work and see how you can connect with Educators for Migrant Justice and her campaign. We'll share some information, a link to her website at the end of this session. So now I want to turn to Sylvia Johnson. Sylvia is a filmmaker and impact strategist. Her work has been screened at film festivals around the world, and she is a 2018-19 National Geographic Explorer working on an upcoming film called Mermaids Against Plastic. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Sylvia currently splits her time as creative director between Free Roaming Studios, a small film production company, and Santa Fe Dreamers Project, which is a nonprofit working on the front lines of legal protection for immigrants. Her film, Refugee, shines a light on the pain and suffering endured by people incarcerated in our inhumane immigrant detention system. Sylvia's film has been screened in communities and has been used as a tool to galvanize communities and inspire individual and collective action. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you so much for having me, Malika, and thanks to everyone for being here today. I also just want to say thank you from Alpha and Zeffirino, who are featured in the film. I always ask them if there's something that they want me to say, and they always say that they hope that people are more than just moved, that they'll take action around this. So they're grateful that you have watched the film or are going to watch the film, and that you're interested in how you might get engaged. So as Malika mentioned, I work with the Santa Fe Dreamers Project. It's an immigration legal services organization here in New Mexico. And it's in that capacity that I first went to Cibola County Immigration Detention Facility that you see highlighted in the film. I want to give you a little bit of background about the facility. The Cibola prison was a criminal correctional facility that was closed in October of 2016 because the conditions were so bad that they led to several inmate deaths. It reopened in February 2017, immediately after the inauguration, this time to house immigrants. Same facility, same guards, same conditions, different contract, but same corporation running it. I was completely horrified by what I saw there and by the realization that this is what we're doing to immigrants and refugees in this country, many of whom are not in any violation of law and are engaging the asylum system in the only way possible. So I was there initially in the capacity of providing legal orientation and translation. And over many months of going to the prison, I befriended some of the guys like Alpha and Zeffirino that you see in the film. So many of the people that I met are incredible, resilient human beings who've been through unspeakable trauma. And I knew that if they got out, they would want to tell their stories, which is how we came to make this film. We have this idea in this country of refugees as tired, huddled masses, and sometimes that's the case. But often lost in that narrative is that people fleeing for their lives come from all walks of life and have left entire lives behind. Alpha, for example, speaks 7 languages. He's a professional soccer player. He was a student leader back home. Now that he's out, he's working on going back to school at Columbia University and getting another degree. Zeffirino has 2 master's degrees. He speaks multiple languages, and he works as an industrial automation engineer. As he says in the film, he used to volunteer to help refugees, and today he is one. It could be any of us in that prison. The thing to really understand is that their stories represent thousands more like them from all walks of life who can't tell their stories, either because they're still detained, they've since been deported back to their home countries, or they never survived the journey to get here. The only people coming to our southern border right now are people fleeing for their lives. Almost no one is coming to make a better life for themselves. The stakes are too high. All of these asylum seekers are currently being incarcerated in some form by our government, paid for by our tax dollars. Almost everyone we see in these facilities has to go through what is called a credible fear interview to prove that any reasonable person in their shoes would have feared for their lives, and almost all of them pass this interview. What's happening in these facilities is in direct violation of international human rights agreements. I'm going to read these just to make sure I get them right. Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all people have the right to seek asylum in another country. And the UN Convention on Refugees explicitly states that prohibited penalties include being arbitrarily detained solely on the basis of seeking asylum. The conditions we see on the ground in these facilities are horrible. They include things like spoiled food, maggots, dirty water, serious medical neglect that sometimes results in death. And increasingly, we are seeing the use of solitary confinement as a form of punishment, which is really concerning. And as you've probably seen in the news this week, these conditions appear to be deteriorating even more as the numbers of those apprehended continue to increase. So as of 2017, ICE is the primary contractor of private prisons. And as Malika mentioned in the beginning, 70% of immigrants are detained in for-profit prisons. The entire model of these facilities depends on having a constant supply of bodies and beds. There are some 200 facilities like this across the country. Most of them are in rural places like New Mexico, Texas, Georgia, places where there's very little access to legal counsel and very little oversight. So in our thinking of how to design the outreach around this film and how we could best use it to help people push back on this inhumane system of incarcerating refugees, especially at a time when federal policy towards immigrants is really hostile, what we kept landing on was divestment as a key pressure point for change and hitting these companies where it hurts. It's one tactic in a much bigger picture around immigration, but it's a powerful one. Money speaks loud. This prison divestment movement has been building over the last decade, largely led by Freedom to Thrive, as Malika mentioned as well, and has really been gaining momentum in the last couple of years, and especially since the beginning of 2019. And I see a lot of potential for change around this. The fact that JP Morgan's Chase and Wells Fargo announced that they'd be exiting those financial relationships was in direct response to public pressure that happened in January and February. It's a small step. A lot of things still need to happen and they need to be held accountable to really do that, but they are feeling the pressure, that's for sure. And Geo Group recently submitted a report to the SEC, and in it they indicated that the primary risk factor that they face in continuing this business model is the public pressure that they're feeling. So I encourage you all to get involved because there is real momentum around this, and I see a lot of potential for impact. I think that knowingly and unknowingly, for most of us unknowingly and unwittingly, we're complicit in the systems that make this possible. And we all have a role in dismantling them. These systems center profit over life. The entire model depends on that. So we need your help in ensuring that it becomes too toxic for these companies to operate and for the banks to underwrite the loans that finance them. It's a fine line for us between banning prisons in just a couple of locations or pressuring just a couple of banks and having the results be the dislocation of the problem and the prisons move to another location. The whole system needs to be so toxic that they are no longer able to operate nationwide. So we've really been using the film to try to drive this conversation, and we've had a series of screenings here in New Mexico as well as in Colorado so far. And the communities who have seen it are following up not just with individual divestment, but also with protest against some of these big banks and pushes to divest both cities and state-run educational retirement funds, which is one of the big things we're focusing on here in New Mexico. So I'd love to have these conversations happening in communities across the country. And to that end, we're making the film available for community screenings anywhere and have designed a screening toolkit that will help you both organize a screening and facilitate the conversation about how to take action. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out to me and we can work with you to make that happen. And I'll turn it back over to Malika, but I'm happy to answer any questions as we go. Oh, you're muted, Malika.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Sylvia. And we so appreciate the work that you're doing. We want to make sure to open up the time for our viewers to ask questions. So please go ahead and you can just type in your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll ask them. But before we do that, I have a few questions of my own I wanted to put to you both. Actually, Kirby, could you, just for our viewers, to help everyone understand what can, as individuals and as individual investors, what steps can you advise people to take in their personal investing or in relationship to their investment advisors about this issue? And you're muted too.
Thank you. Apologies. So the first step really, when you're thinking about your own personal divestment journey is to understand what you own and what your exposure is to these companies. A really great place to start if you work with a financial advisor is to ask them about this. And this is a great way to broach with your financial advisor, not only a conversation about divestment, but just about better aligning your investments with your values. If you've never had that type of conversation before, that's a really good way to open it up. If for whatever reason your financial advisor is not helpful, or if you're more of a do-it-yourself investor and you need to investigate maybe some mutual funds that you hold, there's a really great tool. The American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization, has a tool that they've launched called Investigate, which allows you to put in a ticker symbol for a mutual fund or to upload a list of holdings all at once. And you can see what your exposure is, both to private prison companies, to companies involved in occupations, to companies involved in issues at the border. And I know that both at the end of the webinar, but also in the email that goes out to attendees, yes, it's on the screen now, but in the email that goes out after this event, there will be links to that Investigate tool. Those are some things that individual investors can do. If your only personal investments are through your workplace, then you're going to want to talk to your plan administrator, for your 401k about what investments are in those plans. The first step would be to contact someone in your human resources department and get the information about who to talk to and see if it's, possible to divest out of certain companies if you're able to. Another good idea that individual investors can take advantage of is looking at the involvement and complicity of their banks and their credit card companies. It is actually very easy to see who the shareholders are of CoreCivic and Geo Group. I mean, we already talked about the 6 major banks that fund these companies, but you can go to NASDAQ's website, actually, NASDAQ, and look up CoreCivic and Geo Group, and you'll be able to see a list of institutional shareholders, which you can sort alphabetically. And so you can easily look up, any bank or credit card company that you want to, and then obviously take appropriate actions afterwards. And I should say, if anyone has any follow-up questions about any of those actions or needs help with them, feel free to get in touch with me or just to ask a question here, and I'd be happy to help.
Right, great. Yeah, that's some really helpful information and some concrete steps people can take personally. Sylvia, you have had the experience that not many people have had of really in person being there, seeing what's happening, meeting the people who are inside these facilities. And I know you had a chance to visit the South Texas Family Residential Center, which sounds really nice. It sounds like what a great name. What people most know the South Texas Family Residential Center as is baby jail in Texas. Could you tell us what that was like?
Yeah, we were there in March with a team of attorneys, and as you mentioned, we call it baby jail because it is essentially just that. It is the Cibola facility that you see in the film is a facility for men, and there's a transgender pod there, but it's only an adult male population. And the baby jail in Dilley, Texas is moms and kids under 18, I believe. And if you think about the prisons as prisons and the baby jail as an internment camp is kind of a good analogy. It's also run by CoreCivic. They are incarcerated. They're not held in cells the exact same way that the men are in the prison facility, but they are incarcerated. They are wearing prison uniforms. Babies that are a few months old to 10-year-old kids are in prison uniforms. They are escorted by guards. Many of the conditions that we hear being terrible in the adult facilities are the same there, especially food is the largest complaint, that the food is often horrible and maggots are frequently found in food. It's spoiled, it's past the date. I definitely saw women who felt like they were going crazy being held in there with their children. And it's not family separation in the way that we saw last summer, but often these families come as a family unit, and then the father is sent to an adult male facility, an older child may be sent to another facility, and the moms and babies are held there. So then they're split and they don't know where their relatives are. It is truly heartbreaking, hard to see.
Yeah, and I wanted to really clarify, because I think this might come up in viewers' questions when they see your documentary about Alpha and Zeffirino, the refugee film that we've been referencing. So the film is about African asylum seekers, but in the news right now, of course, we're hearing mostly about immigrants from South and Central America. So why did you focus on them, and what is the connection there?
Yeah, really good question. While there are asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world that come to our border, the large majority of them are from the northern triangle of Central America, and that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. I would say, I'm guessing at a number here, but 80 to 90% are probably from those countries. And they are in these detention facilities at the mom and baby jail. The baby jail in Texas, it's almost exclusively people from Central America. And similarly in the adult male population, that's what we see. The reason the film follows these two Africans has to do with how political asylum law is designed. It came to be after World War II, and you have to fit a particular nexus that ties the persecution that you experience directly to your identity, your religion, your race, or your participation in a particular social group. And the persecution that most Central Americans are fleeing from often does not fall into those categories, or is much harder to prove that it falls into those categories. Therefore, actually most, I think it's only 10 to 20% of Central Americans actually win their asylum cases. So Alpha was the very first asylum case that the attorneys I work with won, and he was the first to get out of that facility, and then Zeffirino came shortly after him. And because their cases fit asylum law much more easily, those were stories that I was able to tell because they were released. Many of the others are either still detained or have since been deported back to their home countries. And so they're stories that I wasn't able to tell because I didn't have the access to tell them. However, I will say we just had a short piece, 5-minute piece that we can also send you a link to after this webinar that follows one of our transgender asylum seekers from Honduras. I believe she's from Honduras. That does give a little bit of insight into what that experience is like as well.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to ask you both. You know, that we've seen some tremendous wins here. As you mentioned, Kirby. You know, the state of New York has pulled out money from private prisons. Wells Fargo and J.P. Morgan have at least said they're going to. What would you say? What can you identify as kind of a key next step? You know, what would real change look like as we look forward on this issue?
Sylvia, did you have something you wanted to say right away?
Sure.
Or I can go.
And then I'll go.
Well, I mean, I think for me, and I mean, I don't know if this is too personal, but I mean, you know, we saw this order rescinded in 2017 under the Trump administration. And I feel like, you know, after this webinar was scheduled, just within the last 2 weeks or so, we've seen renewed focus, and there's just been kind of a public outcry around these facilities that it seems like it's quickly becoming unacceptable to a very wide swath of American people. And so I would love to see some action again on the federal level towards this. I don't see how this can continue to be ignored at that level. That might be wishful thinking, but I guess if that can't happen, then I would love to see at the state level, states continue to take leadership on this and kind of fill that gap.
I would say that what's happening at our southern border is a humanitarian crisis. It is not being treated as such, and what we need to understand as a country and move away from is the criminalization of people of color who have not committed a crime. And I think that we can have no acceptance of this idea of incarceration as an option for people who are fleeing for their lives and haven't done anything wrong. So I would have to say I'm not optimistic that there will be change under this administration at the federal level. I do think that what's happened in the last week has demonstrated that our agencies can't manage the flow of people that are coming, and that it truly is a humanitarian crisis, and there need to be new solutions to that. So hopefully that will come, but I honestly feel like the power is at the grassroots level, and that money on this particular issue speaks very, very loud. For example, immediately after Obama passed that bill saying that there would be an end to private prisons, CoreCivic stock fell by 40%. In the lead up to the election, those two companies spent close to $2 billion on lobbying for the election cycle. And the day after the election, the stock prices for these prisons skyrocketed again. So I think there has to be continued pressure on the banks and continued pressure on the prisons. I think Wells Fargo and J.P. Morgan are truly feeling the heat, but they need to be held to the fire. They need to actually follow through what they say that they're going to do and fully divest, not just stop financing this. But I think those other banks need to also be held accountable for that. And I see the work that Real Money Moves is doing out of California is shifting towards really focusing on Bank of America and SunTrust now, because we can't just move the financing from a couple of the big banks, then the prisons will just go to the other ones. It needs to be across the board. This becomes completely unacceptable. The other place I see a lot of room for movement is in retirement funds, especially public education retirement funds. When educators realize that their money is invested in making this inhumane system possible, they get furious. And there's a lot of money in that. So I think that's like a really tangible place for the divestment to happen, as well as an individual divestment.
And that gives me just a moment to refer back to Emily Claire Goldman and her initiative around Educators for Migrant Justice. And she definitely has been the voice that she relies very heavily on the members themselves who are, through, she has a toolkit that people can use to kind of develop their skills to become activists as members and create change. And that's the kind of grassroots activism that we're talking about. When you're personally invested, when your retirement fund is invested, you can take action to really make a powerful change in the way pension funds make their decisions about what they're going to invest in, and of course in your own portfolio. I'd like to ask just personally, let's see, I'd like to hear actually from you in particular, Sylvia, what really brought you, to do this work? Why?
Yeah. I'm an immigrant to this country. I was born in Bolivia. My family lived in El Salvador when I was a child. We fled the night the Civil War broke out and were able to leave the country because of the color of our skin and the place of my passport. And that is not the case for most of the people that are coming. So I think that's originally how I ended up working with this immigration organization. I can put myself in their shoes. It could be any of us. And the film, why? Because how could I not? The things that I was saying were so horrendous. And I think most Americans are starting to get a glimpse through the media, and the glimpse is small compared to the scale of the incredible inhumanity that is happening. And I think that people need to know. So I couldn't not do it.
Understandable. I didn't know that you were also, that was your experience, that you were a refugee yourself. I didn't realize.
Well, I wouldn't put us in the category of refugee, but we definitely fled in the middle of the night.
Well, thank you so much to the both of you. I want to put out the invitation again to the viewers. If you'd like to submit any questions, if you have anything you'd like to ask our guests, this is the time for you to get your questions answered. And as I await any questions, I don't see any at this moment, but I want to make sure to, if we could take a moment, I want to just acknowledge Sylvia Panic, whose name you can see, and she is our behind the scenes coordinator here and has been managing everything behind the scenes on this webinar. And I'd like to just make sure that we actually show our resource slides right now as something that you guys can use, you viewers can refer to, but for where you can learn more and ways that you can become involved in taking action.
Malika, I see one question. Oh yeah, she's asking about the toolkit and the PowerPoint. I think there are links in what we're sending out to various action toolkits. If you're specifically interested in the film screening toolkit and bringing that to your community, please contact me directly. And that's at sylvia@santafedreamersproject.org, and I can connect you to those resources.
Okay. And I see a question here too. Was that the question from Cynthia Martin that you just addressed, Sylvia?
No, it's not.
Okay. All right. Well, I have a question here from Cynthia Martin. Thank you for your question, Cynthia. She's saying she just received notification that Trump signed a bill for $4.6 billion to go to border funding. She says, I certainly believe that divesting from private prisons is important, but how much of an impact can be made if tax money is increasing?
I would answer that partly by saying that, one argument against divestment that I've heard is, well, how effective is this really? If somebody divests from a company, it just means that other people are going to buy the shares. And I would answer that in two ways. First of all, that is why institutional divestment is so important. And as Sylvia J. just noted, there is a lot of room in state pension funds, in teacher pension funds and things like that to really make a significant financial impact. But also, divestment is more than just taking your money away. It's it's a statement, it's a movement, it creates awareness, it's educational for a lot of people. I think that divestment has a lot of, I don't know if soft impact is the right word, that is greater than just the removal of the funds. And so, even though it is discouraging to hear that there's that much more money going to the border, I certainly think that divestment is still a valid and important tool. But that's why we have toolkits, and and that's one tool in them. But there's other things that we can do to push back on this. So
one additional thing I would say to that is that these ICE contracts are paid for with our tax dollars, and it is Congress that's authorizing those contracts to go through. So I think regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, as we lead up to this next cycle, I think it's really, really important to push politicians and our congresspeople to really have a stance on what they're doing around this, because those are our tax dollars that are facilitating this.
And Sylvia, one of our viewers is asking if you're planning to share this film with churches and synagogues.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, both here in New Mexico and in Colorado. Here in New Mexico, we've worked with the Santa Fe Faith Network for Immigrant Justice. They've been one of the primary groups that has really taken action around this and led a big protest at our Wells Fargo here in town. We had over 500 signatures on a letter to Wells Fargo pushing for full divestment that was delivered at various branches by leadership from different faith communities, and also sent to the head CEO, and they are starting to initiate some of the work around divesting from the New Mexico Board of Education's holdings in these companies. So absolutely, churches and religious communities are a big part of the communities that we're making the film available to anyone who wants to screen it, religious or not.
Good. And a viewer is asking, how can we follow whether JP Morgan and Wells Fargo actually follow through in stopping their funding of private prison groups? And also, how can we find out if or when they will eventually cease being shareholders in these companies? Are you aware of where people can track that?
I don't know if there's a specific place that would be tracked. I mean, you could set news alerts for those companies to see what is being done. There's definitely campaigns that are pushing banks to divest, and it would be good to align yourself with one of those campaigns. I know in Sylvia J, on your website for Santa Fe Dreamers Project, in your resources tab, you have links to a lot of different campaigns that are involved with divestment. And so audience members can connect with those to kind of keep track on this. And then as far as keeping track of whether or not they divest their shares, I only found out that they were shareholders just by looking it up on the NASDAQ website. I'm not saying NASDAQ is the only source for that information of the institutional shareholders of those companies. It was just the one that I found. But I would be happy to show you how to look that up if you would like to. But that was just a little investigative work I did on my own. So
yeah, it can be very hard to track what they're actually doing.
It can be, yes.
I feel like my assumption in this particular case is that they're guilty until proven innocent, and that they need to be held to the fire until it's public. I mean, they announced that they were going to stop, that they're going to exit these financial relationships in front of Congress. There's a woman who's been writing about it a lot in Forbes. So I think it will be publicly made available as news if they really do this. And until that's clear, I tend to assume that they have not.
Mm-hmm. I'm just noticing a few comments I wanted to draw attention to. One of our viewers in Boston actually earlier today saw Wayfair employees walking to protest the sale of beds to an ICE contractor. And what I think is significant here is just pointing out that not only is it the private prisons themselves, but it's also all of the suppliers of services and materials like beds or prison uniforms or food to private prisons, that these are also companies that can be targeted. You guys have any additional things to say about that in terms of activism around the entire network of support for the private prison industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, was that you? The parallel industries is a multi-billion-dollar industry of everything that supports what's going on in these prisons. Everything from transportation to medical care to the uniforms to beds. And I don't have the list of companies off the top of my head, but we do have a fact sheet on our website that also outlines a little bit of what's going on with these parallel industries. And even Amazon is implicated in all of this. So I think there's lots of room for activism on those companies as well.
Do you have anything to add, Kirby?
I was actually getting a link for somebody in the Q&A. So I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question and I can?
Yeah, basically it's about the associated or adjacent companies that are supplying the private prison companies themselves. That that this is not only is there activism that can be done about the private prison companies themselves, but also all of their suppliers. And if you had any other additional input about what people think about or do on that level as well.
I would again bring up the Investigate tool from the American Friends Service Committee. That is an incredibly robust website. They have lists of companies and their exact relationship to the different human rights violations that they've identified. I was really impressed at the wealth of information that is present. So you can do way more on that website than just look up mutual funds. You can find out how different companies are involved at different levels and complicit in different ways in the whole kind of ecosystem of the world of private prisons. So especially for individual investors, that's a great place to start in looking at that.
Okay. I think I don't have any other questions here from our viewers, and so I feel like we might have reached the end here of our conversation. I want to thank you both so much for all the work that you've been doing, and I also want to make sure that people are aware that in this webinar you'll have information at the close here about the different resources that we've mentioned, the toolkits, and also you will receive by email follow-up information, all of our attendees. Any last words that you'd like to share, either one of you, before we wrap this up?
I would just say thank you for participating, and I encourage everyone to learn as much as they can and to truly engage with this issue. It runs deep and it's ugly, but there's a lot that can be done about it, actually.
And I would just echo that. I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Malika and Sylvia and other Sylvia, for all of your work on this. And what Sylvia J just said is right. Just learn as much as you can and then share that knowledge, because a lot of people are in the dark about this.
And we really encourage people to reach out to Sylvia Johnson and get access to this documentary, and please use it as a tool in your community. There's been some great action in Santa Fe with this film, and so we hope that you will see this as a resource that you can use in your community as well. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks so much to our viewers. We appreciate your time with us today.